Hello everyone and welcome to the Narrated tutorial covering the whole process of the Kendrick Lamar drawing that I have recently finished. The reason I created this drawing in the first place was so that I could put something like this together and go through a few different methods and drawing techniques that I'm sure you'll all find useful. So here we are starting out with the image we are drawing. I printed this out so I could use it as a reference, and I'd always recommend having a printout of the subject or at least something you can refer to. And also, if you are using a grid to proportion the drawing, then you'll need a copy of it printed out. And so for this drawing I used a set of Faber-Castell pencils, but I didn't really use all of them. I mainly used a 2B and a 7B for darker shades, and then also a harder pencil like a 2H for sketching the rough outlines. So to start off this drawing I used a grid, and it's a good method to use to accurately proportion the drawing correctly. Some people don't like using a grid, but if you are just starting out drawing or having trouble with creating realistic proportions, then it's a very good tool to use and take advantage of. To make a grid you just want to use a ruler and work out how big you want the grid to be. You can use any kind of measurement for each section of the grid as long as they are all the same, and so I went around the image and measured it out before then linking them together to form the shape of the grid. Now after that's done on the image, you want to replicate the same grid over onto the paper you are drawing on, and the paper I'm using here, by the way, is called Bristol board. It's like a thick card and it's really good for realistic drawing, so make sure you use a light pencil to draw the grid because you will be drawing over it or rubbing it out later. Just do it dark enough so you can still see it. So finally, once you have a grid drawn out on both the image and the paper, you are ready to start doing the rough outlines, and the best way to do this is to focus on each individual section of the grid at a time and keep referring to the image. You should be able to have an accurate outline and some rough proportions by the end of it. Okay, so once I had some rough outlines, I started putting more work into the eye, and I always seem to start drawings by working on the eyes first, but I suppose you could start at any point you might find best. So here I'm just carefully looking at the reference and trying to create some more solid, permanent outlines. Here on screen you can see the reference and how I'm trying to create the more darker areas around the eye first. It's also important to outline the highlighted areas of the image. You might notice I'm also using a mechanical pencil in some areas. This is because I sometimes find it easier to be more accurate at outlining details. Now I'm filling in the pupil here, but I also outlined the areas of the pupil that will remain solid white, and then just completely filling in the rest of the pupil using a very dark 7B pencil. What might be helpful is to lay down some basic shading first and try and achieve the correct tones, and then like I'm doing here you can go over it with a mechanical pencil and try and create the details. What gives it a realistic impression is the texture you place on top of the shading. When it came to drawing the eyebrow, it was difficult to differentiate each individual hair. As you can see on the reference, it's also one solid shade, and so I used a mechanical pencil to try and replicate this by creating a darker gradient that would just blend across. There's also small highlights in the eyebrows, and I sometimes try to create these by leaving small gaps between the strokes of pencils I'm creating, but I've also seen some people go over the solid shadows with a white gel pen or even some kind of highlighter to make those really stand out. From using the grid and observing the reference image, I was able to put more work into the nose and also the lighter texture that seemed to be underneath the eye. There's never one simple way to draw realistically, because if you are looking at a reference then that really gives you all the information, and this type of drawing is all about having the skills and ability to recreate it as best as possible. So I was trying to recreate some similar textures by laying on different types of pencil marks and also looking at the light and shadows. Moving on a little bit, you can see that I had made a rough skin-like texture around this cheek, and to do that I just made some light marks over some shading. You want to make sure that you blend the base layer of shading you create so it gives a smooth gradient. Also the moustache, which was similar to the eyebrow, had like a darker area on the side, and then underneath the nose I was focusing on each strand of hair. The shadow underneath the nose was also blended so that it merged into the facial hair and the upper lip. The priority is probably just using a sharp pencil or a mechanical pencil and trying to pick out the small details. I'm always working from the rough outlines I made earlier, and it's almost like just filling in the gaps with pencil marks. This lip had a shadow over one side and then it fades across. Lips usually have a texture that goes up and down, if that makes sense, so likewise with this image, the lips had creases in them going up and down that also created small light and dark shadows. So when drawing the lips I was trying to focus on the up and down strokes of the pencil rather than any other motion. Then of course finishing it off by going over this and creating the correct tones and shades. Right, so here's some more footage of me drawing the lips and working on the facial hair. I don't want to seem like I'm repeating myself and dragging on because a lot of the drawing is just repeating the same process. That's one thing when it comes to realistic drawing, is that you'll need a lot of patience and focus to create the details. I've also noticed that the texture is really obvious in my work, and that's what seems to give the image some realistic qualities. So on the bottom lip you can notice a difference in contrast between the shading, how the bottom lip has some lighter shades over it, and here I'm just moving the pencil up and down to create the texture. Later on I also went over this bottom lip again and made it a little darker. Underneath here there was a shadow that made this lip stand out. A contrast between the light and dark areas is always important. Using the grid also helped me easily work out the length of everything and where things should go, so when it came to drawing things like the hair on the side of the face, I was able to easily see how it should look. Okay, so let's take a big jump forward right here to where I was working on the other eye, again using the darkest pencil I could to achieve those solid black shades for the pupils, and also leaving the lighter areas alone. Here's another glance at the reference in regards to what I was drawing, and you can see that I also seem to work on the darker areas first, and then apply some lighter shades and texture. On this eyebrow it had a lot more texture than the last one because it was hitting more lighter areas, and just like when I was drawing the facial hair, I focused on each strand of hair separately, and then being sure to leave some gaps in between to give the impression of the reflections and also the skin underneath. The grid was really useful on this next part because it let me stop drawing one area of the face and move on to something completely different like the hair. I always use the same technique to draw hair, which just consists of observing the image and making pencil marks for each strand of hair that I see. Looking at each section of the grid, I was able to continue this up along the side of the face before then working on some skin tones. So I had finally finished the ear and managed to create the surrounding hair. I'd always recommend using the darkest pencil you have for the hair to make it stand out from the shade of the skin. In this drawing, the dreadlocks of the hair was the darkest and stood out the most, so I used a 7B. You can get darker pencils and even use charcoal. I didn't use charcoal for this drawing however because I just wanted to stick with pencils. When creating darker shades you want to apply a lot of pressure on the paper and only do small strokes. Keep referring to the reference image and outlining lighter areas that you also want to avoid shading. So we have gotten through a lot of this drawing now, and I hope I'm not just repeating myself. It's mainly just using the same techniques and following the same process, and eventually I had finished drawing the hair, and then I started to fill in some of the skin tones. The best advice I can give for realistic skin tones, which I might have said already but I can't really remember, is to firstly apply a base layer of shading, looking at the reference image and working out if it's light or darker shades you'll need to use. Then use a blending stump or your hand to blend the shading together smoothly. You can take a small eraser or start removing areas of the shade to create a textured skin appearance, and then take a lighter pencil and start making some extra details. That's probably the best technique for skin texture. But everything can easily change and it depends on the reference image and what you are drawing. Here on this image, one side of the face was darker, so I used a darker shade that gradually smoothed out into a lighter one. So let's jump into the next section of the drawing, which is the fair coat, and this was a bit of a challenge to draw. Now with any hair and fair texture, it requires a lot of patience. So to do this, I started off by drawing the main outlines of the fair coat and how it meets the face. And then when I had an outline, I started to create some soft pencil lines. And also I kept referring to the reference image to see whereabouts I should draw certain elements that stood out. For instance, on this coat there was sometimes darker areas, so I used the grid to draw these, and then I had more points to start working from. I found that the best way to create this fair texture was to create some pencil strokes in the direction of the fair, and then sometimes work into it with a darker pencil, also leaving gaps in between some areas because you want each bit of the fair to appear separated. The top section of the coat had a lighter shade than the bottom, so when I started to draw the lower section I was making darker marks. For this bit I was also making shorter strokes and leaving a lot of gaps in between each one. I was able to create this texture quite quickly, unlike the upper section of the coat. It wasn't all just like the same process because there was different sections to the coat which I had outlined before working into them, using both light and dark pencils to create contrast between each of the sections. I wasn't really observing the reference image constantly here because I just wanted to focus on being able to produce a texture which suited the drawing. So there is a lot of fur here, but you can notice the darker areas that I had started drawing from. Usually the fur went all in the same direction, except in some areas where I had to change it up a little bit and draw the lines that went in other direction. From looking at the drawing, it seems like it's definitely the darker areas contrasting with the lighter parts of the fur, which give it some impact. Sometimes I went over some light shades of fur with a darker pencil and created small shadows around them, just to make them stand out more. Okay, we're nearly at the end now. So I finished the fur coat and most of the drawing was finished. I always step back and compare it with the reference image just to see if there's anything else that needs changing. Usually I have to make some areas darker or maybe go over something to make it look better. With this drawing I noticed that I needed to make some more of a shadow around some facial features like the nose and forehead. You should take some time out at the end of every drawing to review and go over it all. There wasn't much that needed changing on this one because whilst I was drawing it I was already focusing on making things look as accurate as possible. So I had to make a few adjustments to the shadows and to the skin tones before finally erasing the grid from around the drawing. And you can see that at the end of it all you can't even see the grid. This is because we had drawn it really lightly and so the drawing even covered it up. And that about brings it to an end, so I think I have covered most of the process. Go take a look at the finished time-lapse as well because you might be able to take something from that. But yeah, that's the Kendrick Lamar realistic portrait done. And I might do some more of these in the future. I have been working on some other projects, but as for this drawing, I'd say it's pretty much finished now. So of course if you have any questions then comment them below and I'll be sure to reply to them, but other than that, thank you for watching.